The church was already full when Elvis Presley walked through the door. Greater Salem Baptist Church, Chicago. A Sunday morning in the spring of 1957. Every pew packed. The air thick with perfume and old wood, and the particular stillness that settles over a room when something is about to happen, and everyone can feel it, but nobody can name it. Elvis was 22 years old. The biggest name in American music. The face on every magazine cover, the voice on every radio. He had performed for screaming crowds of 50,000. He had appeared on national television 3 times in a single year. He had done things no performer his age had any right to do. And yet, standing at the front of that church, he looked like a boy who wasn't sure he belonged there. Reverend Austin introduced him to the congregation with careful, measured words. Then he turned and gestured toward Mahalia Jackson, seated in the front row, hands folded in her lap, watching Elvis the way a woman watches something she hasn't decided about yet. Elvis stepped toward her. He extended his hand. The room went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. A child stopped fidgeting. A hymnal slipped from someone's hands, and nobody reached to pick it up. The women in the second row stopped fanning themselves. Even the light coming through the tall windows seemed to hold still. Mahalia Jackson looked at his hand. She looked at his face. And she did not move. 3 seconds passed. Maybe 4. Long enough for the air to change. Long enough for Reverend Austin to shift his weight behind the pulpit. Long enough for everyone in that sanctuary to understand that what was happening in front of them was not going to be simple. She did not take his hand. And what she did instead changed every person in that room. To understand what happened that Sunday morning, you have to understand who these 2 people were before they stood in the same room. Mahalia Jackson had not arrived at Greater Salem by accident. She had built her way there 1 note at a time. Born in New Orleans in 1911, she grew up in a house so small that 6 people shared 2 rooms. Her aunt sang hymns while scrubbing other people's floors. That was where Mahalia first learned that music and endurance lived in the same place. She moved to Chicago at 16 with $1.50 and a voice that didn't yet know what it was capable of. Greater Salem's choir found out within the first rehearsal. The room stopped when she opened her mouth. It always stopped. By 1957, she was the queen of gospel music in America. She had filled Carnegie Hall. She had sung at a presidential inauguration. She had turned down a $25,000 Las Vegas contract because she believed God's music did not belong in a casino. Every offer that asked her to compromise her voice for money, she had refused. Not with anger, with the quiet certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was and what she was not. Elvis Presley had grown up 3 states south and an entire world away. Tupelo, Mississippi, a 2-room house with no electricity and no running water. His mother, Gladys, took him to the Assembly of God Church every Sunday from the time he could walk. He fell asleep against her arm during sermons and woke up during the singing. That was where music entered him first. Not from a radio, from a room full of people who needed it. As a boy, he used to stop on the street outside black churches in his neighborhood and listen through the open windows. He never went inside. He just stood there, absorbing something he didn't have words for yet. By 1957, the world called it rock and roll. But Elvis had always known where it came from. The black gospel community knew where it came from too. And many of them were watching their music make other people rich while the people who created it remained poor. That grief was real. That anger was earned. Mahalia had received 3 letters that week from members of her own congregation. Each one said the same thing in different words. Don't let that boy use your name. 2 weeks earlier, Elvis had sent her flowers and a handwritten note. She had not responded. 2 people, 2 worlds, 1 room, and a handshake that hadn't happened yet. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier, and it had surprised everyone, including Mahalia herself. A mutual friend in the gospel community had arranged a meeting. Neutral ground. A hotel lobby in Memphis. No cameras, no managers, no press. Just 2 people and a table, and whatever honesty they could bring to it. Elvis arrived early. He was alone. He sat in a corner chair with his hands folded and waited. He did not order anything. He did not look around the room the way famous people sometimes do, checking to see who had noticed them. He just sat there, still and quiet, until Mahalia walked in. She sat across from him and studied him the way she studied everything. Carefully, without rushing to a conclusion, he asked her questions, not about fame or record sales or what she thought of his music. He asked her about gospel technique, about how she prepared spiritually before she sang, about whether she believed the voice and the soul were the same instrument or 2 different ones. The questions were not what she expected. She had come prepared for performance. Instead, she found something that resembled sincerity. At one point, she said it plainly. I hear your records. That's not gospel. That's something else. Elvis didn't flinch. Yes, ma'am, he said, but it comes from the same place. She asked him what gospel meant to him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her about his mother, about Gladys singing in the dark when they couldn't pay the light bill, about standing outside a black church 3 streets from his house when he was 8 years old, listening through the open window to something that went straight through him before he was old enough to understand why. Mahalia listened. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said, "Come to my church Sunday. Come, and we'll see what you're made of." Elvis said yes before she finished the sentence. But that night, back in her own home, Mahalia sat with the decision. Her congregation's trust was not something she could offer on someone else's behalf. She had built that trust over decades, note by note, Sunday by Sunday. It was not hers to gamble with. She opened her journal and wrote 1 line. Is this God's bridge or man's publicity? She did not answer the question that night. She closed the journal and went to bed. She had invited him, but she had not yet decided what she would do when he arrived. Sunday morning came fast and cold. Elvis arrived at Greater Salem 30 minutes before the service began. Every seat was already filled. People had come from across the South Side. Some came curious. Some came hoping to witness something. Some came ready to be offended. All of them came. He sat in the front row in a dark suit that was slightly too formal for the occasion. His hands were not steady. A single bead of sweat moved down his temple despite the coolness of the sanctuary. He stared at the floor in front of him, and every few seconds his eyes would move to Mahalia's face, looking for something. A signal. A sign that he hadn't made the worst mistake of his life. The service ran its normal course. Songs, prayers, testimonies. The congregation came alive the way it always did on Sunday mornings. Full-body worship. Voices rising, hands raised, people moving with the kind of freedom that only comes from years of practice in the same sacred space. Elvis watched all of it and did not move. He sat still inside a river of sound and let it run over him. Then Mahalia stood. She walked to the pulpit slowly. She did not look at Elvis. She looked at her congregation, the people she had known for decades, the people whose trust she carried every time she opened her mouth. God does not audition, she said. Either your heart is in it or it isn't. She paused. Let it settle. Then she turned and introduced him. Elvis stood. He walked to the front. The walk felt long. Every step carried the full weight of every eye in that room. When he reached her, he extended his hand. A reflex. A gesture of goodwill. The only thing he knew to do. Mahalia looked at his hand. She did not take it. Instead, she raised both of her own hands and placed them gently on either side of his face, the way a mother checks a child for fever. Warm, unhurried. She held his face in her hands and looked at him for 3 full seconds without speaking. The room did not breathe. Then she said, quietly enough that only the front rows could hear, "Don't perform for us. Sing to God and let us watch." She stepped back. Elvis turned to face the congregation. He had no guitar, no band, no arrangement to hide behind. Just his voice and the room and whatever he had brought inside him from Tupelo. He began to sing, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." Thomas Dorsey's song, written in the deepest grief of Dorsey's life. A song that belonged to this community in a way Elvis had no birthright to claim. His voice broke on the second line. He did not stop. He sang through the break. And something in that decision, to keep going with a cracked voice instead of starting over or stopping, changed the temperature of the room. 4 rows back, Thomas Dorsey closed his eyes. His lips began to move. By the 3rd verse, the congregation was with Elvis, not because of his name, not because of his fame, because the broken voice was real, and that room had spent decades learning to recognize the real thing. Mahalia began to hum behind him, low and steady, like a current beneath the surface. Then she began to sing. Their voices found each other without rehearsal, without arrangement, without anything except the song and the truth inside it. When the last note ended, no one moved, and then Mahalia did something no one expected. The silence lasted long enough for a child in the back row to start crying. Nobody shushed her. The sound of that child was the only sound in the room for several seconds. And somehow, it was exactly right. It was the sound the adults couldn't make. It was the thing the room needed to release before it could move again. Mahalia turned to Elvis. She reached out and took his hand. The same hand she had refused minutes before. She took it in both of hers and held it firmly, the way you hold something you have decided is worth holding. Then she turned and faced her congregation. She did not speak. She didn't need to. The gesture said what words would have crowded. The congregation understood. Reverend Austin rose from his chair behind the pulpit and walked to the front. He was a tall man with a slow, deliberate way of moving that made people pay attention before he said a word. He stood beside Elvis and looked out at his church. "I have pastored this congregation for 19 years, he said, "and I will tell you something I know to be true. The Holy Spirit does not carry a press pass. It does not check your name against a list before it decides to show up. It goes where it is called. And it was called here this morning." He put one hand on Elvis's shoulder. "This young man came into this house with something genuine, and this house recognized it. That is what this church is for." A murmur moved through the congregation, not of disagreement, of recognition. Then Thomas Dorsey stood. He was 67 years old. He moved slowly, one hand resting on the pew in front of him as he made his way to the aisle. The congregation parted without being asked. People stepped aside, the way people step aside for someone who has earned that kind of quiet respect over a lifetime. He stopped in front of Elvis and looked at him for a long moment. "I wrote that song the worst night of my life," Dorsey said. His voice was low and even. "I have heard it sung by the greatest voices in gospel music. Voices that could shake the walls of this church. But you sang it like a man who needed it. Not like a man who wanted to impress anyone. Like a man who genuinely needed that prayer to be heard." He paused. "That is the only way that song is supposed to be sung. You earned it this morning." Elvis could not speak. His eyes were wet. He nodded once, slowly, and that was enough. People began to come forward. Not rushing, not in a wave of emotion. One at a time, the way people approach something sacred. Factory workers in their Sunday clothes. Elderly women in good hats who had been singing in that church since before Elvis was born. Young men who had come that morning ready to be skeptical and were no longer sure what they were. They touched his arm, his shoulder. Some of them said nothing at all. A few pressed his hand briefly and moved on. One woman, old enough to be his grandmother, stopped and looked at him and said simply, "Your mama would be proud." Then she walked back to her seat. Elvis stood in the middle of all of it and did not perform. He did not smile for the room or say the gracious things a famous person learns to say. He just stood there and received it, quietly, like a man who understood that this was not the moment for anything other than stillness. When the last person had come forward, Mahalia leaned close to him. Her voice was low enough that it belonged only to him. "You didn't need my handshake," she said. "You needed to earn the rooms. You did that yourself." Elvis looked at her. For a moment, he seemed like he might say something. Then he didn't. He simply nodded. And in the nod was everything he couldn't find words for. He left that church carrying something no manager could book and no chart could measure. Neither of them ever spoke publicly about what happened that Sunday morning. Not Mahalia. Not Elvis. No press release. No interview. No carefully worded statement from a manager or a publicist. The silence was not accidental. It was chosen. And the chosen silence of two people who could have made it into something else said more than any words would have. In the weeks that followed, something shifted quietly in both communities. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The way ground shifts after a long rain. Slowly and beneath the surface and permanently. The letters to Mahalia from her congregation slowed and then stopped. The women who had warned her wrote nothing further. Some of them had been in that church that Sunday. They had seen what she had seen. There was nothing left to warn her about. Elvis went back to his music. He did not speak about Greater Salem in interviews. He did not use it. He did not trade on it. He simply carried it with him the way a person carries something private. Something that belongs to the interior of a life rather than the surface of it. In 1963, Mahalia sang at the March on Washington. 250,000 people fell silent within 4 seconds of her opening note. That same evening, Elvis sent her a telegram. One line. No signature beyond his name. "Still learning from you." She kept it. When Mahalia died in January of 1972, 45,000 people filed past her casket in Chicago over 2 days. Aretha Franklin sang at her funeral. The world gathered to mark the end of something that could not be replaced. Elvis did not attend publicly. He sent no flowers. He made no statement. Instead, he sat alone at Graceland that night and played her records until the sun came up. Nobody knew that for years. But it was true. After Elvis died in 1977, the people who went through his personal belongings found what they found. Stage costumes, gold records, the accumulated evidence of a life lived in public. And on his turntable, still resting on the spindle where he had left it, a gospel record worn smooth from years of use. In a private room, among private things, they also found a recording, never meant for release, never meant for anyone. Elvis alone in a room with a microphone, singing "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." No band, no arrangement, no audience. Voice completely unguarded. Raw in the way a voice gets when it has nothing to prove and nobody to prove it to. Just the song. And the man. And whatever that Sunday morning in Chicago had planted in him, that never left. The refused handshake was never about rejection. It took time to understand that. From the outside, it looked like a closed door. But Mahalia Jackson had not closed a door. She had opened a different one. One that required more than a gesture to walk through. A handshake can be performed. A smile can be performed. Graciousness can be performed. Mahalia had spent enough years in enough rooms to know the difference between a person extending a hand and a person extending themselves. She was not interested in the first. She was only ever interested in the second. What she asked of Elvis that morning was not talent. It was not fame. It was not even humility in the way people usually mean that word. She asked him to be unguarded in a room that had every reason to stay guarded against him. She asked him to need the song instead of using it. And he did. And the room heard the difference. Have you ever stood somewhere you weren't sure you belonged? Where the room had every reason to keep its distance? Where the only thing you had to offer was the honest truth of who you were, and you didn't know if that would be enough? That is where Elvis stood that Sunday morning. And what happened in that church tells us something worth remembering. That the real thing is always recognizable. In any room, across any divide, to anyone who has learned to listen for it. Honesty does not need an introduction. It announces itself. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone standing in a room where they are not sure they are welcome. Someone deciding between the safe version of themselves and the real one. Drop a comment about a moment when you chose the real thing and it changed everything. And if you want more stories about the moments when truth showed up where nobody expected it, subscribe and turn on notifications. These stories are everywhere. You just have to know where to listen. She didn't refuse his hand to hurt him. She refused it to save him from the wrong kind of yes.